quiz to my gentlemen viewers. What do Regency protagonist of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy, humanitarian Henri de Saint-Simon, American President John F. Kennedy, and celebrity artist Andy Warhol all have in common? They were all men who wore corsets. Around the beginning of the 1800s in England was the Great Masculine Renunciation. This was a time when many men gave up their peacockish, flamboyant ways and out went the bright silks and the velvets and the jewels and other embellishments. And in came, the plain wool suits and the slacks and the very crisp white shirts, also vests, waistcoats, cummerbunds, and corsets. This was said to be led by George Bryan Bromwell and other men of the middle to upper class at the time. They wanted to appear aristocratic and sober. They did not want to appear foppish or ostentatious, nor did they want to seem, poor or frugal. So this was a nice middle ground for all of them. Ironically, around this time, many women actually tossed aside their stays and they opted for more flowy Grecian gowns that started at the empire right underneath the bust and did not emphasize the smallness of their waist at all. So all you ladies out there reading Pride and Prejudice and they're kind of fanning themselves and going, "Oh, Mr. Darcy," remember, he's probably wearing a corset. In the following decades, many men still wore corsets, and in the 1830s, with the Industrial Revolution, men's corsets became more widely available, as did women's. Now, before, the men's corsets were usually straight up and down. They promoted a very slim figure. But around the time of 1820s to 1840s, the wasp waist was very popular for men. So they did have a very cinched and pinched-in waist. Well into the late 1800s, men still wore corsets, or back braces as they were called at the time, to help control their pot bellies and to give them back support. And many men still had valets to help them dress, the same way that women had housemaids to help them dress. This was in England. Around this time in France was the French Revolution between 1890 to the early 1900s, and dandyism rose up again as a fashion statement to separate the aristocrats from the bourgeois. So in ancient Japan, the samurai class used to often wear sarashi. Now I had mentioned sarashi before in one of my previous videos with concerning women and pregnancy. But often men and women both wore the sarashi. For the samurai, the sarashi was very useful because since it was a very thick piece of bandage wrapped very tightly around the chest and the rest of the torso and the midriff, it actually helped prevent these samurai from getting slashed quite so easily whenever they got into sword fights. For more formal battle, they donned something called the haramaki, which is not a belly warmer as it's known today, but the more wealthy had haramaki that was made completely out of wood or metal, but many men, when they went off to war, they had a smaller haramaki that went over the belly and tied with cords in the back, and this was often made out of silk with strips or plates of metal inside of it. So its construction sounds very much like a corset, and also it was donned and tightened in the same way like a corset. Often in the 18th and 19th centuries in Western Europe, armor was very close to the skin. So many military men, especially the cavalry, used to wear very rigid stays when they were riding their horse for protection of their spines if they were to ever get thrown off the horse. Also, in the earlier French Revolution, around the end of the 1700s, this was when Henri de Saint-Simon used to wear corsets as both armor and as a humanitarian act, because he was a utopian philosopher, and he felt that the act of men lacing other men into corsets was a very unselfish act that brought people together. In the 1830s, there was a brochure that was released called The Whole Art of Dress, or The Road to Elegance and Fashion. And this was written actually by an Englishman that was in the English military, and it went through what soldiers and officers wore in the military. Often the upper officers wore stays, and they were boned, they were laced in the back, and they were laced tight. Now, often, even at this time in the 1830s, the men's stays were often referred to as belts as opposed to stays, because belts was a little bit more masculine and stays were more in reference to the women's corsets. And over these stays, or belts, the men wore padded coats. It made them appear larger, it made them appear more poised at all times, and it was also protection. If the men ever fell off their horse, it would protect their spine. As years progressed, the English officers gave up their stays, and there was more of an effort to make the upper officers and the lower soldiers look more equal visually in uniform, even though they were obviously different in status. Now, in later decades, the Austrian and the French militia still had stays, as you could see from one of these photos. And I think the last to abandon the stays were the Germans around the 1860s. So clearly, into the early 1900s, there was a decline in corset wearing among both men and women until around the 1920s, when it was pretty much tossed aside completely with the emergence of the boyish look that was in fashion at the time. However, President John F. Kennedy did wear a corset for his bad back, and also Andy Warhol, after he was shot by an assassin, he was confined to wearing a corset for the rest of his life. So many men still kind of did secretly wear corsets at the time. Now, there were back braces at the time, but those were very large and bulky, not very practical. If you look back on many of the old style braces for children suffering with scoliosis, you'll understand what I mean. Although the men's corset as a fashion statement is not very often seen in the mainstream today, the men's military corset, however, is seen very widely in the form of a sports belt in the gym. Many accomplished heavyweight lifters will tell you that in order for the belt to work optimally, to prevent lumbar strain on their backs and to prevent hernias, then these belts have to be adjusted very tight around their waist to increase the intra-abdominal pressure on their organs. And these men, they don't have a whole lot of squish to them. They're very muscular. So you don't see any reduction in their waistline per se, but nevertheless, the physics is all still there. So I want to thank Rockathon 3 for giving me the original tip of the German militia wearing the regulation corsets in the mid-1800s. So I'm going to post a couple of links down in the description on some websites on male corsetry, where you can find corsets for men, some websites on famous male corseters such as Mr. Pearl and Fakir Musafar, and also, I hope if you don't mind, I will also post a couple of YouTube channels on some very wonderful, dashing looking male corseters that I have met on YouTube since I started doing these videos. So if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to send me a comment or a message, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!